Welcome to episode 47 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by actual FBI cases. In this episode, we speak with retired agent Dick Marquise, who served with the FBI for 31 years. Marquise is an expert in the field of counterterrorism and crisis management, both as an investigator and as a manager. Marquise is interviewed about Pan Am Flight 103, blown out of the skies over Lockerbie, Scotland on December 21st, 1988, 4 days before Christmas. 270 people were killed. Marquise was involved with the investigation of this bombing from its inception and after being named to lead the U.S. task force, which included the FBI, Department of Justice, and the Central Intelligence Agency. He managed the investigation through the return of indictments in 1991. Marquise also played an active role through the court proceedings, and in August 2001, with the successful resolution of the trial, he received the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service. Following the case, which was codenamed ScotBom, Marquise' bureau career included the role of Special Agent in Charge of the FBI's Oklahoma City Division. He has provided training to law enforcement officials and has appeared on television and radio talk shows, and has given hundreds of speeches all over the world on the topic of terrorism. In order to document the facts of the investigation, he wrote ScotBom, Evidence and the Lockerbie Investigation, a non-fiction account of the international terrorism case. Both Dick and I recognize that this was the perfect week to post this episode, just a week before Christmas. He mentioned to me that as the parents of the victims get older, fewer and fewer people are able to attend the annual memorial service, which takes place every December 21st at Arlington National Cemetery. That's why I feel so honored to be able to share this investigation, this case file review with you. So on this December 21st, there'll be more people who will remember all of the lives lost on December 21st, 1988. My pound puppy, Canyon, my yellow lab mix, must have known that this was a special episode, and he attempts to participate throughout the recording, so you'll hear him barking. We can talk more after the interview. I do have a crime fiction recommendation and some other things I'd like to say to you before the end of the year. But let's get right to this very special episode. Here's the show.
Hi, everyone. I want to introduce you to my guest, Dick Marquise. Hi, Dick. How are you?
Well, good morning. I'm fine, Jerry. How are you?
I'm doing great. I am very excited to speak with you about this case. It's frightening to think that, you could be traveling, going to visit family or on a business trip, and that the airplane you're on could be taken down by a bomb. It's just a frightening concept that most of us who, travel on a regular basis don't ever want to think about. But you spent, I take it, a number of years investigating this transatlantic flight that was destroyed by a terrorist bomb.
Well, absolutely. But what actually makes it a little bit worse, it was 4 days before Christmas. And a lot of the travelers were government employees, students, traveling home for families. There were a lot of Christmas presents on the plane. And you can just imagine the excitement about coming home. Some of these kids had been overseas for a semester abroad, and they were coming home, and 38 minutes after takeoff, the plane explodes at 31,000 feet. I can't imagine anything more horrific than that.
Before we get into that, so that we have an understanding of the expertise and the experience that you brought to this investigation, could you tell us first when you joined the FBI and why you wanted to be a special agent?
Well, I was sort of a unique person because my dad was in the FBI. Oh. And he was an agent for 25 years, and he was still in the FBI when J. Edgar Hoover, the former director, announced that he wanted to hire 1,000 agents to work organized crime. I was hired in 1971 as an agent, and my whole goal was to be an FBI agent my whole life and investigate cases. But I was particularly interested in terrorism because there had been a bombing at the University of Wisconsin in about 1969 or 1970, right before I joined, that killed a researcher. And that really troubled me, the fact that we had domestic terrorism going on in the United States. And so I joined the FBI with the thought that I was going to try to make a difference in the world, and I ended up spending 31 great years with the FBI and loved every day that I worked there.
Well, that's fantastic. There are a number of, father-son and father-daughter combinations in the FBI. And I know in Philadelphia, we had the Murray family. We had 3 or 4 brothers that were FBI agents. So, it is definitely can become the family business.
Well, I'm only a little disappointed because none of my 3 boys decided to become FBI agents. So the generational chain has ended with me, but between my dad and I, we had 56 years of service to the Bureau, and they were great years.
Fantastic. Now, we want to get to that case, but if you can just real quickly, real briefly, tell us what else you were doing before you were assigned this particular investigation.
Well, my second office of assignment was Detroit, and I was literally on the ground floor of working counterterrorism in the United States after the attack in Munich in 1972. It's when I first became involved. I became a supervisor in the Philadelphia field office in the mid-1980s, but in 1986 I was transferred back to FBI headquarters where I took over the research unit in the counterterrorism section. But when the bombing of Pan Am 103 happened, my section chief asked me to take over running the investigation at headquarters. And then a short time after that, we consolidated both the headquarters and the Washington field office task force, and I ran the entire task force for the FBI.
So did you work domestic terrorism your entire career?
No, I actually was a supervisor of a surveillance squad. I was a supervisor of a resident agency, so we did a little bit of everything. My workload in Detroit was predominantly foreign counterintelligence and the other national security investigations, including counterterrorism. But I also worked on a white-collar crime squad, as well as I did a lot of general in criminal investigations in violent crimes in my first office in Minneapolis. So I had a very varied career, and it became more specialized when I was transferred back to counterterrorism.
Okay. So this Pan Am Flight 103, this investigation, did it have a code name?
Yes, the FBI is big on naming major cases. It was Major Case 20, and the code name for the case was ScotBom because the plane fell over Scotland.
Okay. So where were you when this first happened, and when did you start working on the investigation?
Well, I think it's important for your listeners to understand that until 1984, it was not illegal for someone to commit a terrorist attack against an American overseas. And Congress passed legislation in 1984 and 1986, so-called extraterritorial statutes, that allowed the FBI to participate in extraterritorial, outside the United States, investigations involving terrorist attacks against Americans. Well, on the afternoon of December 21st, the flight blew up. It was either, at the time difference, it would be 5 hours, but there's some distinctions in December. But it would have been about 2 o'clock in the afternoon or in the United States when the plane fell out of the sky. It was a little after 7 p.m. in Scotland. And I was actually having lunch with someone just before Christmas, before I was going to go on vacation, and I was paged to come back to the office because we were told that a plane had exploded over Scotland. And it took about 4 days for investigators on the ground to find the first evidence that it was a high-powered explosive that brought the plane down. So the FBI didn't do anything immediately, but right after the first of the year, after it was determined that it was a bomb, we started to set up the task force in Washington, and we sent FBI agents to London, to Germany, and up to Scotland.
And where did you go? Were you supervising most of it from headquarters?
Yes. We stayed. We only sent over a liaison agent. The legal attache's office in London, the FBI office in London, sent up, I think, 4 or 5 agents. And we had a representative from the FBI who was a relatively brand new agent who went over and handled the liaison responsibilities. I think that, in fact, I know for a fact that the FBI would have done it differently had this case happened today. But in 1988, our extraterritorial expertise was somewhat limited. We didn't have very many cases that involved us working with other governments. Most of them were cases where we sent agents over to do interviews of passengers on airplanes. We never had to coordinate those with other governments. This would be the first time we ever had to coordinate a major investigation like this with another law enforcement agency, intelligence agencies, and another government. So the way we responded in 1988 would be very different than how the FBI would respond today.
Now, and I know I'm skipping ahead to the end, but that working relationship with the Scottish police or the Scottish investigators, did that work well? Was there friction? Was there issues? Or did it seem to work out well?
Well, the first problem we had, even though they spoke English, it was not the same English that we speak. We had some very big differences in communication issues. So we had to sort of understand each other. But from a law enforcement standpoint, there were a lot of issues. And I guess to put it in perspective, Squad 13, so the Metropolitan Police handled at that time all of the counterterrorism investigations in the United Kingdom. They showed up in Scotland, and the police in Scotland told them to go back to London, that they were going to be in charge of this investigation. And the Dumfries and Galloway Constabulary was the smallest constabulary in all of the United Kingdom. They had 333 police officers, and the biggest crime problem that they had faced in the previous year was bicycle theft. And these officers really didn't understand any of the international dealings, but they really came up to speed very fast. We had some, I would say at least a year and a half of not trusting each other, doing things independently. It took us a while to get on the same page. But once we did, and again, a lot of this had to do with relationship building and who you know and who you get along with, that allowed us to eventually solve the case. But the beginning stages of this case, for at least a year and a half, almost 2 years, was very testy, to say the least.
Of the people killed, what percentage were Americans?
Well, there were 270 people killed, 11 people in Lockerbie, 259 passengers and crew, and of those 259, 189 of them were Americans. So the vast majority were Americans coming home for Christmas.
Wow. Was this the first, or how many planes have been destroyed by a bomb before this?
Just a handful. Literally not that many, but between 1985, I think was the first one, Air India flight, there were some significant attacks against aviation in the 1980s. But Lockerbie was the third one that took place in the 80s. There was one in 1985 with Air India, killed 329 people. In the 1980s, there were 4 significant bombings. Over 1,000 people were killed on bombs that blew airplanes up in the 1980s. There were actually 26 attacks against aviation in the 80s, but 1,081 people were killed. It was the most significant year of attacks against aviation, but 4 of those killed about 80% of the people. Lockerbie was the third. It was a Korean airliner blown up in 1987, and then the Libyans were responsible for another attack against a French plane in 1989. So it didn't happen often, but unfortunately it happens.
All right, so definitely during this period of time is when the FBI really learned how to investigate this type of event.
Well, I mean, there had been, if you go way back in the United States in the 1950s, there was a man that wanted to collect insurance on his mother, and he gave her a Christmas present, and the Christmas present was a bomb, and he blew the plane up over, it was a flight out of Denver, and blew up over Iowa or Nebraska, someplace like that. And the FBI was very involved in that case, and eventually they identified the person that did it. So we do have some expertise and experience. Now, I want it to be very clear that the evidence collection in Scotland was all done by Scottish police. We asked about, could we send over resources to help comb the crime scene that turned out to be 845 square miles. And we were told in no uncertain terms, no, this will be done by Scottish law enforcement officers, and the FBI never was involved in the evidence collection process.
And today, if it were to happen today, would we be invited to, for most countries, in the most part, would we be invited to participate in that?
Well, I guess some of the things I can think of today that you could almost compare it to the East African bombings of the embassies in 1998 in Kenya and Tanzania. Now, those countries did not have capability. They recognized two things. It was these were American embassies. We were the target, and we have vast capabilities that far exceeded what they have. They invited us in very early. We sent over literally hundreds of agents to each scene to collect the evidence at the crime scene. I think a lot of it depends on the country. Now, clearly, if this happened in a sophisticated Western country such as the United Kingdom and France, I guess we have to think about how we would feel if an Israeli airliner blew up over Michigan. Would we invite the Israelis to come and conduct crime scene searches and interviews unilaterally? I think we would probably allow them to come in and work with us, but I think we would want to control things such as the crime scene. So I understood where they were coming from, other than the fact that we could have sent a lot of resources there to help collect the evidence, but I certainly could appreciate their attitude and what they did. So I think today it would be dependent upon the situation.
All right, but in this particular case, even participating or being there to just monitor was not allowed?
Well, we sent over, other than the legal attache's office from London, and they were mostly there in a liaison capacity. There was a young agent from Washington field office who went over, and he did a tremendous job in terms of liaison, and he facilitated things. And one of the things that I learned very early on, and when I wrote my after-action report, I was very critical of some things that we did not do in the early stages, and that was not send over a senior official that could be in the decision-making process, because we discovered that there would be things found at Lockerbie, and they would not have been shared immediately, and the Scottish police were off doing something, and the FBI, conversely, we'd learn something here, and we'd go off and we'd do something. That coordination was missing in the early days of the investigation, and it took a while before we finally figured these things out, and it took a couple people to sit down and say, we need to fix this, and we need to make sure that we're sharing information, because this is a case that needs to be solved.
All right. So, what was the first indication that this was a deliberate act and that it had been a bomb?
Well, right after, I believe it was right around Christmas Day, there was a piece of what turned out to be the baggage container. In a 747, luggage goes into large aluminum and fiberglass containers, and those containers are loaded on the airplane. There was a piece of an aluminum baggage container that was discovered in the fields in Lockerbie that had pitting and cratering. It was black soot and marks, and the forensic evidence determined that there was unconsumed particles of Semtex, it was then a Czech-made plastic explosives that brought the plane down. So literally within a week of the investigation, the British Aviation Authority announced that it was a high-powered explosive, a bomb that brought the plane down. So that was clearly, we knew right after the first that a bomb had brought the plane down, and we speculated it was probably terrorism as opposed to any other criminal enterprise, organized crime, drugs, revenge. But you certainly can't rule all those things out. But we suspected terrorism from the very early stages, and there were a lot of indicators that led us to that belief.
Could you tell me what some of those indicators are?
Sure, absolutely. In October, right, just 2 months before the bombing, the German BKA, their federal police, disrupted a cell of the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine General Command, the PFLP-GC. That cell in Germany was actually building bombs to be placed in a Toshiba radio that would go onto an airplane, and the airplane would go up to above 10,000 feet. The bomb would arm, and about 30 minutes into flight, the plane would blow up. So this cell was disrupted. One of these bombs had been recovered. The information was shared with all aviation entities around the world. It had been shared with law enforcement and intelligence agencies. So we certainly suspected that this could have been one of the things that caused that explosion. But there were a lot of other things going on. The United States government, just 6 months before, had shot down an Airbus belonging to Iran Air and killed 290 pilgrims accidentally in the Persian Gulf, the USS Vincennes, on July 3rd, 1988. And the plane fell out of the sky, killed all these people. Well, the Iranians were very upset with the United States because they believed it was a deliberate act, because there was a war going on between Iran and Iraq, and the U.S. government had sent ships into the Persian Gulf to help the shipment of oil coming to the West, because we didn't want the oil to stop flowing. So we had a lot of threats. There were threats from Libyans, there were threats from Palestinians, and there were threats from Iranians. So again, that was the major reason that we suspected terrorism. And the first few claims came from an Irish terrorist group and a couple other unknown groups, but these all turned out to be bogus claims for taking credit for that attack.
Why this particular flight? Do we have any idea why this flight leaving from London was the one selected?
That's a very good question. Pan Am 103 that flight actually started in Frankfurt, Germany. But it started as a Boeing 727. And when all the passengers flew from Frankfurt to London, they transferred on to the 747. That would be the plane that blew up. But that flight number actually started in Frankfurt. And, of course, the fact that that Palestinian cell had been operating in Germany 2 months before led us to believe that, particularly in the very early stages, that cell was somehow responsible for bringing down that flight, even though the two cell leaders were still in jail on December 21st. But as we went through the investigation, we discovered something else, because we're going to make an allegation in our indictment and prove to trial that the bomb actually started out in Malta. And if you look at an aviation guide to get from Malta to the United States, if you wanted to attack an American carrier, you would take an Air Malta flight to Frankfurt. You'd catch Pan Am 103, take that to London, take Pan Am 103 to New York, and then that flight would actually go on to Detroit. But that would be the way that if you were just going to route a bag, that's the way a bag would be routed.
So you believe, or the investigation determined, that the bag containing this explosive device originated in Malta?
Yes. And it took us probably about 6 months into the investigation. As the evidence started to be collected, we find little bits and pieces that would eventually lead. It was clothing found in the crime scene that led us to Malta and led us to investigate on this small island in the Mediterranean.
This is fascinating, how you collect these little pieces of evidence and bring them all together to show the big picture. Can you take us from the beginning as you're starting to learn these pieces?
Sure, absolutely. It was about the 1st of February when an examiner in Scotland was looking at a piece of that baggage container that had contained the bomb. And when he banged it on the floor and shook it, a very small fragment of a circuit board fell out. And it's so small, I have a photograph of it sitting on a man's finger, and you could see his fingerprint still with this small fragment. And when this fragment was eventually compared to a circuit board, we discovered it was a Toshiba radio. Now, of course, that would immediately led us to believe that it was the Palestinian cell because they were using Toshiba radio altimeter bombs. The only difference in the two radios was one was an older model single speaker, the other one was a two-speaker radio. But the brand was exactly the same. Well, all throughout early 1989 up into the summer, investigators were finding fragments of clothing, fragments of suitcase, and by midsummer of 1989, we determined that the Toshiba radio had been in a suitcase, a Silhouette 4000 Samsonite suitcase made in Denver.
How do you know that?
Well, two things. There were actually fragments of the suitcase were discovered, but they found the locking mechanism. And the locking mechanism came to only that suitcase. And it was identified by the folks at Samsonite in Denver as that type suitcase that had the bomb in it. But eventually they were finding fragments of clothing, and they found clothing, and they found labels in the clothing, and some of it said "Made in Malta." And of course, I had to get a map out to figure out where Malta was. But
I'll do that after the interview.
Yeah.
Because
well, in the summer of 1989, one of the fragments of clothing that was found had the word Yorkie, Yorkie, written on it. It was sort of a manufacturer. It wasn't really a label. It was actually, I don't think it was embroidered, but it was into the shirt. And this, on the other side of it, it actually had a lot number, so it could be traced back to a company. It was traced back to the Yorkie Clothing Company in Malta. And we discovered that the Yorkie Clothing Company had actually sold that lot number to a local store in Malta on the 18th of November, 1988. So we started to think about this. By the early fall of 1989, we've got all this evidence of Malta that not the luggage came from there, but most of this luggage we would determine was sold in the Middle East. This particular model of suitcase. But we've got this clothing, and there's a lot of made in Malta clothing, and we have this fragment of clothing that the examiner said absolutely was in the bomb suitcase, sold to a store owner in Malta in November of 1988.
How do we know the bomb was in that suitcase?
Well, the thing we did know about that particular bin of suitcases, that most of the suitcases in there had come from the Frankfurt flight, okay? So that meant that there were Frankfurt originating passengers, but there were also other people who flew into Frankfurt to catch that flight. So the luggage that was in that suitcase had come from, most of it, the vast majority had come from Frankfurt. There were a handful of bags that had been placed on the bottom level that had come from people coming into London to fly. But there were no London originating bags in that particular container. But when they started to examine all those bags that had come from Frankfurt, and they'd find a whole suitcase and say, here's a whole suitcase, not even damaged. Maybe it's dented, or if it's soft-sided, it's just dirty because it fell on the ground, 31,000 feet. But when they looked at the suitcases, they started to say, okay, this one, it's got some damage to it, so it must have been near the seat of the explosion. Well, as they started to examine all of the bags that were recovered, they could find some that were actually blown up, but there were some, they called them blast damage, but the ones that they called significant blast damage, they said because of all the experience that they've had dealing with IRA bombs over the years, they said these bags, this bag was the seat of the explosion, and the particular items of clothing were near the bomb, just based on their forensic examination.
You know, I forgot about that. You mentioned the IRA and, bombings and events that, occurred. So who's doing this investigation? Because you're right, they would have experience with explosives and evidence gathering?
Well, the Scots did not have a forensic laboratory per se. All of the forensic evidence went down to a laboratory in London. They sent it there. We asked to send over examiners from our laboratory to work with them, and they politely declined. We offered to have the evidence come here, but I can understand that again. We always recognized they were in charge of the investigation. In fact, the FBI director Director Sessions told them very clearly in the very beginning, you lead and we'll follow.
Okay. And it sounds like they did a fantastic job in making the determinations of what evidence was crucial to the case and what needed to be collected and saved. It sounds like they did a fine job.
Well, they did. Now, here's where we start to have a bit of where things are beginning to disconnect. That small piece of cloth, that Yorkie clothing that we traced to Malta, that was also blasted into or had blasted into it other fragments. And when that was all taken apart, they discovered a couple of things. One of them, they found black plastic. They found an instruction manual for the Toshiba radio written in Arabic. So we knew pretty clearly that we had the right Toshiba radio. It was not the one that the Palestinians used in Germany, but it was a different radio. But also blasted into that cloth was another fragment of a circuit board. But we wouldn't find out about all this until January of 1990. Scots knew about it, but they didn't share it. They wanted to do this investigation. They did tell us about Yorkie Clothing Company, and we actually sent an FBI artist because the Scots didn't have that capability. We sent an FBI artist who drew a drawing of the guy that bought the clothing because we found the shopkeeper, and he had some recollections of selling the clothing in his shop, probably in December early December is what we figured. In early December 1988, he had some recollections because this man with a Libyan accent came in. He just bought a whole bunch of stuff, put it in a bag. He didn't care about the sizes, and he bought a sport coat that was wool that this guy couldn't sell just to fill the suitcase. And they found fragments of all those things that were blast damaged. So we could make some assumptions that it was this purchaser. All of these items ended up in the bomb suitcase. But the fragment, this is where we start to have a whole lot of disconnect. The Scottish police are off interviewing the shopkeeper in Malta, unbeknownst to us. But at the same time that we're finding out, because we're always assuming that the bag went from Germany, not going from anywhere else, but from Germany to London to Lockerbie where it blew up. But we had a problem with that, and this is going to be very, very difficult to figure out because the bomb that the Palestinians used was an altimeter bomb, which means if it was on the plane in Frankfurt, the plane should have blown up between Frankfurt and London. We could never quite explain why this altimeter bomb did not blow up between Frankfurt and London, why it didn't blow up until after the plane left London. Now, all of a sudden, we're starting to think that, maybe something happened in Malta because we find out in September 1989 that there was a record at Frankfurt Airport that some woman who had saved it in her desk because the computer overwrote itself after like 72 hours. She saved the printout, and she found a printout for an unaccompanied bag from an Air Malta flight from December 21st that was actually destined for Pan Am 103. So we found a rogue bag in the system, but this is really going to cause us heartburn because we're saying, wait a minute, this altimeter bomb should have blown up then between, if it was a Palestinian device, should have blown up between Malta and Frankfurt. It really caused us difficulty. But this piece of evidence that we're going to find out about and find out what it was by June of 1990 is going to change the whole investigation. This small fragment blown into this piece of cloth that we were told about in January of 1990.
Which makes the connection to Malta.
It's going to make the connection to Libya. But it's also going to connect to Malta, because we could say it's connected to Malta because it's blown into the clothing, but we're going to connect it directly to Libya. But it would take us until June 1990 before we were able to do that.
Let me interrupt for a second to say that you've already sent me some wonderful photos of you with your Scottish counterparts. So I know that you at some point developed these wonderful working relationships. But at this point where we're talking right now, in 89, 88, 89, and 90, how do you know who's doing what leads, who's taking this piece of evidence and trying to connect it to something else? Is there a coordination between the FBI and the other international investigators as to who's doing what?
Perfectly honestly, no. The seat of the investigation is at the Lockerbie Incident Control Center in Lockerbie. It's being run by a detective chief superintendent from Scotland. The FBI, and one of my criticisms, internal criticisms of the Bureau, is that we did not have anyone in a command decision-making responsibility talking to the Scots every day. And that was a problem. Every time we would get together, and we had international conference in March of 1989. We had one in Germany in 89. We had one in, I think the next one might have been in Sweden in 1990. But there was one in Washington in 1989, and we had one in Scotland in 1990. We kept having all these international meetings, but that was the only time any decision makers would ever go. We never had those one-on-ones. And when I went over to the Washington field office, the first thing I did is I walked into my special agent in charge and I said, "Tom, I need to go to Scotland." And he asked me why. I said, because one of the things I recognized was that we didn't have that one-on-one relationship with the people running the investigation in Scotland. And being at headquarters, we always let the field office run the investigation, even though we were managing at headquarters. But we said, okay, you guys are you're the operational entity, you can do it. I went to every international meeting, but decision-making was not necessarily, I was part of it, but I didn't get to make the final decision. The final decisions were being made over at Washington field office. And nobody had ever gone and sat down with the Scottish cops one-on-one. And I first recognized that after going to an international meeting in January of 1990 when we learned about this small fragment of the circuit board that we're going to now link directly to Libya. I came back from that meeting and I wrote a long memo to my boss, and I just said, we've really got some problems we have to fix. And as a result of that, there's two things. Bob Mueller became the head of the criminal division at the Justice Department, and he is the one that suggested to the FBI that one person coordinate this whole investigation. And my assistant director selected me and sent me over to Washington Field because he felt that anybody from the FBI that knew anything about this case, because of all the briefings I had given, I probably was the most learned, if you will. So I was selected to go to Washington Field to take both my headquarters hat and my field hat and run the investigation from there. And I won't say that it was me that made the difference, but it was me working with my Scottish counterpart because we had to tango together. And I think that we made a good team, and we worked hard on building a relationship. And it's a man that I have a close personal relationship with today.
It's good to hear because, and I'm seldom critical of the FBI on this podcast, so correct me if I'm wrong, but because we acknowledged that they were the lead investigator, every time that we would run a lead prior to you making this coordination, we were almost like the rogue investigator. We were almost interfering in their investigation because they were the lead.
But you could say that. Now, they did have a police officer in Washington field office. They had a liaison. It's like we had a liaison in Lockerbie. But both of these gentlemen, I think we had one lady from Scotland, but most of these gentlemen that went back and forth were very low-level people, and they were not involved in the decision-making process. And you think about it, this case was being run by the SAC directly. And as I told him years later, SACs should not be running cases, because I retired as an SAC, and I didn't have time to run cases. That other people have to do that. And not to be critical of him, but part of the problem was this was an extremely high-profile case. He wanted to be involved, and I totally understand that. But because we didn't have much experience in running these big cases, we had to sort of feel, even as experienced as the FBI was, even in 1988, we had to feel our way through how to run a major case abroad like this. We're very good at doing it in the United States. And my criticism of the FBI was internal, and it was to make us better, because I made a lot of mistakes. I mean, heaven knows I made tons of mistakes myself. But we made them institutionally as well. And I think that we have learned from these things, and I think we do things differently today than we did 28 years ago.
The most important thing is to look at an investigation, do that after-action report, and to make sure you learn best practices. And it sounds like you did that in this particular case.
I think so. I'm convinced. After I left Washington Field and came back to headquarters, I went out. Shortly thereafter, went out as an assistant agent in charge. So my counterterrorism background and experience, I didn't have that direct relationship with CT. But as I look back in 1988, they did not even have an assistant agent in charge responsible for counterterrorism. The criminal assistant agent in charge had everything: violent crimes, white-collar crime. He had everything, including counterterrorism. And today, they've got at least one special agent in charge responsible for counterterrorism. Obviously, it's a whole different ballgame today. But in 1988, they say there wasn't even a assistant special agent in charge, independently tasked with the counterterrorism program.
All right, let's get back into the case. You were telling me that from this radio, you started to learn maybe Libya was involved?
Well, it was now it's the first fragment I mentioned to you was discovered very early on. That was a piece of the circuit board from the Toshiba radio. The second fragment, which was about the same size, and when I saw that in the laboratory, I asked the lab technician, I said, please put that away, because if somebody sneezes, we'd never find it again. It's that small. In this fragment, the Scots told us about it in January 1990 at a meeting in Scotland. And we asked if we could bring it back to the United States or photographs of it, and they told us no, because they wanted to find out where it came from. And it's that whole thing, I'm in charge, I want to get the glory and the credit, and I want to get... And I understood that to a certain extent, okay? I think we would have shared with them what we discovered if we discovered something, because we ended up doing that. Because they went to 55 companies in 17 countries over a 6-month period, and they threw up their hands. They came to Washington in the summer of 1990. They came to Washington, and they said, we have no idea. They had no idea at all what the fragment went to. They gave it to one of our bomb technicians, the photograph of it, and it took him 2 days to identify it.
Wow.
He went out to the CIA, and he sat down, and they have a robust collection of bombs from around the world that have been seized. They have either photographs or copies of them, or if the bomb itself has been seized, they've got them in their laboratory. And Tom not only identified this fragment to a photograph. Tom Thurman was the bomb examiner from the lab. He identified the fragment. They actually had another timer. It was actually a timer. They actually had another whole timer, not just the photographs that he could look at. And it took us a few more months, but we identified the timer. The timer was made by a Swiss company, manufactured in Zurich. And when we interviewed them, we discovered a couple of things. Number one, they had been doing business with the Libyans for decades. This timer, these two timers, they were both identical. One of the timers had been found in Senegal, and we had photographs of that one. The second one was actually seized in Togo, another African country, and that timer was actually at the CIA. And when we compared the fragment that was recovered, it was a piece of the circuit board. It was identical to the Senegal and the Togo timers, absolutely identical. And we discovered through interviews of those principals that they only made 20 of these as prototypes. All of them were given to Libyan intelligence.
Oh, that must have been, I can see the look and the smiles on everyone's face as you make that identification, because, I mean, that was key.
Well, Tom Thurman says, he quotes himself by saying, "Aha, I've got you now." he just said, "Oh, we're going to trace it." But this timer solves one of our problems. It is a straight timer. It's not a barometric device. It's not one of the devices built by the Palestinians that means the plane should have blown up on its first leg of flight. It's a straight timer. You just set the timer and it goes off and the timer goes away. But we discovered, but Tom took the timer apart. He found the company, and the magistrates tell us that not only did they deliver these timers to the Libyans in 1985 and 1986, it was about the same time that the United States government had bombed Tripoli in retaliation for an attack at the La Belle discotheque in Germany. If you remember, Gaddafi's house was bombed, his daughter was killed. The Libyans certainly had a motivation to kill Americans and to attack the United States. And if you remember, President Reagan was leaving office in about a month, and this bombing took place 1 month before President Reagan departed the White House. So we started to think about the motivation. Libyans had the motive. They've got these timers. And then we find out through interviewing the principals that very amazing things happened. We interviewed the principals, and they tell us that in December of 1988, the Libyans contacted them and said, "Remember those timers you built for us back in 1985 and 1986? We need more of those." And they said they did not have one. But the principal, a man by the name of Bollier, traveled to Libya with other timers that he went out to a local electronics store, and he bought these other timers, and they told him they didn't need them because we already have what we need. This was about 5 days before Lockerbie.
Wow. So they set the time for this bomb to go off. Did they mean for it to go off over Scotland, or was it supposed to go off somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean?
Well, we can only guess that they set this thing, and because that you have to go back and think. This bomb left on a flight from Malta before 9 o'clock in the morning. The person that we're going to allege in our indictment that took it to the airport made a phone call at 7 o'clock in the morning. So it's possible. I mean, this timer could be set for anywhere up to thousands of hours. They may have set it on a 12-hour timer. We're going to guess that it was probably set 7 o'clock in the morning, and it blew up at 7 o'clock at night. Mm. We're going to guess that they just said, let's put 12 hours on it. That should be enough time to get out over the Atlantic. And if the winds had not been blowing as strong as it had been the night of the bombing, the plane would have been out over west of Ireland when it blew up, and it would have been over the Atlantic, and we may never be having this conversation.
Wow.
We would have been suspecting the PFLP GC. But there's one other interesting thing before we go to what happened after this. In January of 1989, the media speculation is all over the place about the Palestinians in Germany because their arrest had been publicized. Everybody is speculating that the Palestinians did this PFLP GC cell. Well, an unknown person walks into the American embassy in Vienna, wants to see the ambassador. The ambassador is out or busy, so he leaves him a letter. And in the letter, he said he's a Swiss businessman. Oh, I'm sorry, he doesn't even identify himself. He said, I'm a businessman. I know who blew up Pan Am 103. Everybody's looking at the Palestinians. I think it was the Libyans, and he describes being at a meeting and seeing all these thugs together just a few days before the Pan Am bombing. Well, that letter, we find out about it in January, and it literally gets buried in the files because there's no identifying information. It's a piece of intelligence. If you could imagine all the garbage that I read coming from various posts in the world from the State Department that, I was watching the moon and I realized who did this. I mean, there was so much stuff that was coming in. This was another one of those things of stuff. There was nothing you could ever prove. Nothing. So this went into the drawer. But when Mr. Bollier gets interviewed at the Swiss magistrate's hearing, I'm told he said, I wrote a letter and I gave it to your ambassador in Vienna. All of a sudden, we got a connection. Out of 6 billion people in the world or so at that time, that this guy does not think that we found him because of a piece of evidence at the crime scene. He thinks we discovered him because of that letter he wrote to the embassy. And we had no idea. We had no idea at all he wrote this letter.
And were you able to find that letter after that?
Well, the original letter was in the safe in the embassy in Vienna. But the copy of it, we had a very rudimentary filing system at FBI headquarters. And WFO, as you know, in the field office, you have files. Everything just goes into the file, and trying to find things 28 years ago was very difficult. I mean, we didn't have any searching capability unless you indexed something. Well, we had a very rudimentary file system. We would take every document we had and we put them in folders. And so we could remember, we'd say, well, this relates to timers, this relates to PFL-PGC, this relates to Libya. So we put copies of it in every folder. So we would say, well, this got something to do with Libya. Let's go look through the Libya folder. And when I say it was a rudimentary filing system, it was very rudimentary.
Wow. At least good enough for you to be able to find a copy of the letter once he indicated he had sent one. You were able to find that.
Yes, and by this time, now we're in the fall of 1990. I've gone over to Scotland. I've sat down with my counterpart. We have talked about sharing and collaborating. We had some initial issues, but we worked them through. And about this same time, we have a sit down with the CIA and MI5, and we said, hey guys, we've had too much of everybody independently doing things. Let's work collaboratively together. Let's share information. CIA, you guys go out and find the intelligence, and we'll go see if we can prove it, make it evidence. And that started to work. They started to provide us names. They started to give us intelligence officers' names. All their intelligence was coming to us. And we were able to begin to take names of intelligence officers. We had sent analysts to Malta, and we computerized all of their immigration records for about a 2-year period. So we would have something to search. We wanted to have a searchable database for who went in and out of Malta for a 2-year period, because everything they had was literally in shoeboxes. So we computerized it, and that's going to help us out again when we get to early 1991.
All right, so what happens in early 1991? Are you starting to get names or identifying individuals that might have been responsible?
Well, we had a couple of things happen. Number one, we bring Mr. Bollier to the United States because the Swiss police told us, Bollier's not telling us the truth. We don't think he'll tell us the truth here. Bring him to the United States and interview him. So we interviewed him in the U.S.
And he's the Swiss businessman.
He's the Swiss businessman. We weren't
that
convinced.
Sold the timers.
He's the one that sold the timer, but we were not convinced that he may not have been involved. Oh. We just did not. Our mind, we couldn't wrap ourselves around the fact that he did it, but we just could not wipe him out as a suspect. So we brought him to the United States, and he looks at the drawing of the person who bought the clothes, and he says, that looks like this guy, Megrahi, that I know and I've worked with. And he had talked about him earlier. We knew he was a Libyan intelligence officer. We had a problem with him because we found him in the database for traveling in and out of Malta the same day the clothing was purchased, but not the day the bomb left. That was causing us a problem. We couldn't tie him to the date that the bomb left Malta. But we finally got a photograph. And Bollier is in the United States this week. And we interviewed him at Quantico. And at the same time, this photograph that we gotten from the Czech authorities was put into a photo spread. And it was taken to Tony Gauci, who was the shopkeeper. He just recently passed away. The shopkeeper in Malta was shown a photo spread. Now, he had seen hundreds of photographs. He had never identified anybody. as being the purchaser of the clothing, but we show him a photograph which contains a picture of McGrahy, and he identifies him as being the person who buys the clothes.
Wow.
So everybody's excited. I remember I went and briefed the Attorney General and the Director. Everybody's excited, but I'm told, it'd be really nice to have a witness. We really need somebody that saw something. It's nice to have, it all sounds nice, but you can't even tie him to the bomb. You can't tie McGrahy. You tie him to the clothes, but you cannot tie him to anything around Malta Airport in December of 1988. It's causing us a bit of a problem. Well, about 2 weeks later, I'm on my way to Switzerland and to Scotland, and I'm leaving the office, and I get a phone call from, let's just say I'm not allowed to say the name of the agency. They have a website, and some people refer to them as no such agency, so maybe some of your readers can figure out who I'm talking to. But one of their analysts, because we have shared information dramatically with them, they've given us information. They called with a name, and they said, we've been looking at your buddy McGrahy, and we find him working with this guy by the name of Abdus Samad. But McGrahy shows up sometimes, Abdus Samad shows up sometimes. We don't really know what that means. Do you have anything on this guy, Abdus Samad? So we ran him in the database, and we've only got, I think there was only one record, maybe a couple. But one of the records have him coming into Malta on the 20th of December, leaving on the 21st, the day that the bomb left. All of a sudden, we've got McGrahy connected to a guy named Abdus Samad, and we start to think, this could be something. And I'll just tell you that by the time I got to Scotland, the Scottish cops, it was you got to remember, in these days, there's no email. We didn't have cell phones. So I'm sort of out of direct communications with the Scots while I'm in Switzerland. I'm having a meeting with the Swiss. They gave us some evidence. I'm hand carrying that evidence to Switzerland, to Scotland. We had made a decision to give them these timers that we got, or the timer we had gotten from the CIA. We wanted to consolidate. And again, it was an act of good faith on our part. We wanted to consolidate all the evidence as to where it is right now. We want to give it all to Scotland. We felt they deserve that. So I'm on my way there, but when I get to Scotland, they're pretty excited because they discovered something with this information that I had called to them and said, hey, guess what we got? We've got this guy, Abdus Samad. Well, they're going hot and heavy in Malta, looking him up, and they discovered something. He had stayed at the Holiday Inn that night. He made one phone call, and he called the gentleman who was the station manager for Libyan Air Airlines at the Malta airport the morning of December 21st. So all of a sudden, we have Abdus Samad connected to the station manager for Libyan Air Airlines, that McGrahy was the head of security for Libyan Air Airlines. We're starting to connect all these people. We're not quite sure what we've got yet, but we're starting to connect all of these different things. And we identify Mr. FEMA and discover he's the station manager, that he had already gone back to Libya. He was no longer in Malta. But he left something behind. He left behind his diary. He left his diary in his desk for 1988. Not only that, they interview his former business partner because he'd gone into a private business entity at the last part of 1988. His business partner says, I have my own calendar about what I did in late 1988. He said, did you know that on the night of December 20th, that both Mr. FEMA, the station manager, and Mr. McGrahy, the guy we identified as having bought the clothes, and no evidence he was in Malta that late in December, they came to my house on the night of December 20th. They flew in together from Libya. They came to my house. Now, we have an airline record that shows FEMA and Abdus Samad, this other man that we can't really identify, had flown in together. We're starting to suspect that maybe Abdus Samad and McGrahy are the same guy.
Wow.
We're starting to suspect that this is his false ID. But we find in FEMA's diary, there is a notation. He's got a to-do list. It's on December 15th. And he has all these things, little things like wash his car, because he had a brand-new car, wash his car, get license plates, pick up his laundry. But he has one, and I've actually, not that I don't trust FBI interpreters or MI5 interpreters, but I have taken it to various parts of the world and had native-born Arabic speakers translate it for me. There's one word written in English, and it says, get tags from Air Malta for Abdul Basit Abdus Salam. McGrahy's first name is Abdul Basit, and his notation says, okay. He got luggage tags from Air Malta. FEMA got luggage tags for we believe for McGrahy to put on this suitcase.
Wow.
And this was pretty incredible. But in the summer of 1991, we are fully sharing information. I mean, it's complete sharing with the Scots. I'm in Scotland, and I get a phone call from the SAC, the agent in charge in Washington Field, who says to me, you need to go to Malta. And I told him I couldn't go. He said, well, you remember the source that the CIA had in Malta? They couldn't find him. And I did, because we were allowed to share this information with the Scots. I gave it to them. But a man by the name of Majid had been an intelligence officer in Malta, but he was also, in 1988, but he was also a CIA source, but he had gone back to Libya. And the CIA didn't know what he knew, but they'd gotten him out of Libya. He had gotten him onto a boat, and he was being taken to an American warship. So we sent FBI agents there. I couldn't go. I was preparing for a meeting with, I think that there was a U.S. attorney from Washington coming and Justice Department attorneys, all coming to have literally became our last bilateral meeting with the Scots prior to the indictments being announced. But when we interview Majid, who we eventually bring to the United States, he tells us that McGrahy was an intelligence officer with the Libyan Intelligence Service. He tells us that the station manager kept Semtex in his desk at the airport, which didn't make any sense to us whatsoever. He also said that another senior Libyan official by the name of Saeed Rashid had inquired of him right after the U.S. attack in Libya about the ease of getting a bag onto an American or a British airliner leaving Malta. There were no American or British planes that left there. They were all other Air Malta or Libyan Arab Airlines, but he inquired about it, and Majid eventually went and told McGrahy about that. Then he also tells us, and he doesn't know the exact date, and this interview took over 2 weeks. He tells us that he saw McGrahy and FEMA together with a brown, hard-sided suitcase at Lucca Airport, and based on the evidence, it had to have been after the 15th of December. So we're making an assumption based on other evidence it was the night of the 20th. So it's proving that McGrahy and FEMA were there together on the night of the 20th. It really helped us prove that. And we were going to prove it a little bit later. About 10 years later, it was absolutely proved that that's exactly what happened. But there's a couple of things that we did not know at the time that I know today that have been proven. But one of the other people that was in Malta on the 20th and 21st, and he actually flew back with McGrahy to Libya on the morning of the 21st, was the guy that built the bomb that blew up La Belle Disco. And he's currently in jail in Libya right now for building bombs. And the Scottish police and the FBI have, from what I've been told, unable to interview him, even though he has told several people that he is the person who armed the Lockerbie bomb, that actually put that on the airplane.
Did anybody claim responsibility? You know, a lot of times you hear immediately after an event, somebody's claiming responsibility. Did the Palestinians deny that they were responsible? And why wouldn't they want to claim responsibility if they did this as a way of getting back to the United States? I mean, what purpose? It doesn't serve any purpose at all, but what purpose does it serve for them if they can't claim responsibility?
Well, I think they feared for another bombing of Tripoli, and they did not want that to happen. They did not want, and again, this was done by an intelligence agency. I think groups tend to do things and claim them because they're looking for notoriety. You look at what ISIS does today; they'll do something and they'll claim it, even if they probably didn't do it. I mean, there are people who claim things just to get their name out. Oh, I did that because I want to be famous. But the Libyan Intelligence Service, I don't think they were looking for fame. I think they were just wanting to retaliate. Now, I'll just tell you, to answer your question, in the first 24 hours, 4 groups claimed credit for the attack. The Islamic Jihad, the Guardians of the Islamic Revolution, and the Irish group, the Ulster Defense League. Those are the three terrorist groups. And the last caller said that the Mossad had committed the attack. So, the CIA believed that of all those claims, the ones by the Guardians of the Islamic Revolution was the most credible because of that Iranian threat. And there, you could say that the Iranians had a strong motivation to attack an American carrier. But intelligence-wise, if we had no evidence, I think we could easily have thought that the Palestinians, the PFLP-GC, sponsored by Iran, which I don't know that they would work together, but that there was you could make a good intelligence case for that. But the evidence said clearly otherwise, that it was a Libyan operation through and through.
All right, so at this point, you pretty much know who's responsible individually and as an organization. So how do you get to that next step of the indictment and arrest and prosecution? At the same time, the United States is looking to charge somebody. Is the United Kingdom also looking to charge someone?
Every meeting that we ever had, we had joint meetings. We had police meetings, and then we would have a joint meeting with the prosecutors. And every prosecutorial meeting, the prosecutors would always say, we're not going to make that decision. We're not going to make that decision. But we always knew that, you know what, unless the Scots did not want to prosecute, and that's the reason that those statutes were passed in 84 and 86, to make sure someone was prosecuted for committing these crimes against the United States. Now, if the Scots said, we don't want to prosecute, then we would say, okay, good, we're ready. We investigated the case to the higher standard. Like, we showed 12 photographs because that's what Scottish courts require. So if we would have had a higher standard in the United States for evidence, we would have gone to our standard. We always made sure that we went to the higher standard. Say, if it could be prosecuted in Scotland, it could be prosecuted in the United States. But the police, from an FBI perspective, obviously DOJ wanted to prosecute the case. We presented it to a grand jury in November of 1991. The Scottish, they wrote their report, and they presented it to the Lord Advocate. And both countries announced their indictments simultaneously on November 14th or 15th of 1991. But that final decision about where a trial was going to be, it turned out to be very political because in the United States, anybody indicted faced a death penalty. And in the UK, they did not. They faced a life sentence, but did not face a death penalty. So the agreement would eventually be that either country was ready to prosecute. We had the evidence, we had witnesses, we would prosecute the case, but that decision, the final decision, never took place until there was agreement about where to have the trial. I think that we always speculated that it would be held in Scotland, and it turned out that it was a Scottish court sitting in the Netherlands heard the trial. So it was done in a neutral country. A Scottish court listened to the evidence. 3 judges would listen to the evidence, and it would take 2 out of 3, a simple majority, to find them guilty or not guilty.
We're ready to hear the conclusion.
Well, in November 1991, we knew there were other people involved, but prosecutors felt they had enough evidence to charge McGrahy, because McGrahy bought the clothes. He probably somehow facilitated getting that bag on the airplane on the 20th based on the evidence. And FEMA, he got the luggage tag, and he somehow facilitated getting that bomb on the plane. Now, there were a number of other more senior Libyan officials. Saeed Rashid, the guy that he actually had bought most of those radios that were ever sold in the world. He bought thousands of them because he was a principal in I think it was called the Electric General Company in Libya. And he'd asked about getting a bag on the plane. But there were other senior Libyan officials. Now, the one guy that we could never identify was the gentleman, if you want to call him that, that's currently in jail today. And his name is going to escape me. But we never could identify him. We knew he was there around the bomb, but we couldn't identify him. The only 2 people that we could positively identify that we believed was responsible were FEMA and McGrahy, because we believe that McGrahy and Abdus Samad were the same guy. Because we think that Abdus Samad was involved in getting the bomb on the plane. We think McGrahy bought the clothes. Again, they were the same guy. And FEMA was involved in facilitating getting the bag on the plane. So we thought we would identify them, get them indicted. They would come and tell us the rest of the story, and we would be able to figure this out. Now, the only other thing that happened of significance for literally 10 years, McGrahy and FEMA gave an interview to Pierre Salinger on ABC News. And McGrahy denied being in Libyan intelligence. We knew we could prove that. He denied being in Malta on the 20th and 21st. We knew we could prove that. And he just denied everything. Didn't know anything about timers, didn't know anything about these companies. But we knew we could prove all that. We knew he told a lie. And I realized lying is not murder. But we felt that, you know what, this case, it's solid circumstantially against two people. And obviously it would be great to find other people, but we didn't know if we'd ever get to those other people or not. But we go literally 10 years, and sanctions are put on Libya, and by 1999, Gaddafi's country was really struggling with the sanctions, and as a result, he turned them over to be tried before a Scottish court sitting at Camp Van Zeist in the Netherlands, is where the trial was held. And the thing that, to me, sold the judges, at least on McGrahy's guilt, he brought with him to trial the Abdus Samad passport, which I don't understand why he did that.
That just confirms that he was.
He was the same guy. His photograph is in it. The passport is in there. But we'd also learned when the Scots went to Libya in 1999 before the trial. The FBI did not go because we did not have diplomatic relations with Libya. So the Scots went to Tripoli, they went to the passport office, and they received information. There was a letter in the Abdus Samad passport file that just said, we want a coded passport, undercover passport, for our intelligence officer, McGrahy, in the name of Abdus Samad. So that the Libyans confirmed it officially. And the trial lasted about 6 months. It was supposed to have lasted 3 years. It lasted 6 months. The FBI probably had as many witnesses as anybody. They called at least 3 that I can think of, maybe 4 FBI agents testified. And 2 of them testified for the defense. The defense only called 3 witnesses, and 2 of them were FBI agents, which I thought was a little strange. But McGrahy was convicted. FEMA was acquitted.
Oh, really?
Yes. FEMA was acquitted. They felt that they didn't. Scots law has a lot of rules about corroboration. One piece of evidence is not enough to convict somebody of a crime. You have to have corroboration of everything. And they felt there was not enough corroboration of his diary and the things that may have happened on December 21st. So he was acquitted. McGrahy was convicted. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and he had to serve his time in Scotland, but he was released in 2009 under compassionate release because he had cancer, and he died home in Libya in 2012, always denying his guilt.
You sent me pictures about a memorial service, and I think that's very important because, and we've been talking about the case, and I no doubt know how connected and important the victims are. So I want to spend some time talking about them.
Sure.
Tell me about this annual memorial service.
Yes. Every December 21st at Arlington, there is, the Scots had erected a cairn, which is a Scottish memorial. It's got to do with cemeteries and burial. But they have erected a cairn made from 270 Scottish stones that actually sits high on the hill behind the Lee Custis Mansion at Arlington. If you've ever been to Arlington, it's full of white crosses. This memorial is the most unique thing in that entire cemetery. It's very large, and every December 21st, the families meet there, and at 1 o'clock or 1:30, they have a memorial service that lasts about an hour and a half. And we've had President Clinton's been there a couple of times. When he was president, was there a couple of times. We almost always get the Attorney General, the Director of the FBI, we get, very senior government officials to show up almost every year at this memorial service. And not all the families come because, unfortunately, many of the families, when you start thinking about parents, Syracuse University lost 35 students. Wow. So you think about if all these students, 28 years ago, these kids would be 28 and they'd be 50 years old. A lot of them would be close to 50 years old, which means their parents would be 70, 80, 90 years old. So a lot of them are dying, not able to make long travel trips because the weather's not always great on December the 21st. But I personally learned a great deal about law enforcement working with victims. And I think it's probably really significant to know. And the U.S. government in 1988 didn't really have any solid policy with dealing with victims. The first victim, as I recall, the first victim laws in this country were passed about 1990 to say that there's requirements of law enforcement and how you deal with victims. Well, we sort of, we'll tell you what we think you need to know. And that was probably not right because when I look at what the Scots did things like all the clothing that was recovered that was considered not evidentiary. They washed it, they ironed it, they folded it up, they sent a police officer to the United States or whatever country these people were from, and they hand-carried back their loved ones' personal effects.
Wow.
And you think about what personal service that is, that they hand-carried these things back. And not to say that the FBI, we were really nasty, but I can remember it because the first time I spoke to the victims was in 1990. And I'll just tell you, I was treated harshly because we don't trust the government. We don't think we're going to find out the truth because I don't think that we, and when I say we, it's the bigger we, the government. The State Department did a very poor job of dealing with them. The FBI, I thought, did a better job, but we still hadn't formalized what we were going to do. And I will tell you that I don't know if you know Catherine Turman. Catherine was the head of victim witness services for the Justice Department. And when I was transferred back to headquarters as a section chief, my last headquarters assignment, I was responsible for the victim witness program. And I met with Catherine and told her that there was going to be a Lockerbie trial. She knew that those families really had struggled. She said, if this trial ever takes place, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that these victims are well taken care of. And she took money from the Crime Victims Fund, and she, with that fund, used those proceeds to pay for a 1-week trip for every family member who wanted to go to the trial, because she felt that a lot of them wanted to go and spend some time there. So she ensured every single one of them who wanted to go, she paid for them to go. She had somebody there all the time to talk to them and to be with them. Those families today think Catherine Turman walks on water. She now works for the FBI. She's responsible. She's an assistant director in charge of. It shows you how important the FBI now thinks victim assistance is. They have an assistant director over when at one time we had a grade 15 unit chief responsible directly for victim witnesses unit. But there's now an assistant director at the FBI. But Catherine did a remarkable job. Even though the courts in Scotland refused to let BBC broadcast the trial, Catherine got NSA to set up a closed-circuit secure link to Lockerbie, London, New York, and Washington, so that anybody who wanted to go there, because a lot of the families lived in those places, they could go sit down and they could watch the trial taking place.
That's fantastic.
She's an unbelievable human being, and just I think the world of her. But I think we law enforcement folks have all learned a great deal in the last 28 years, and it's people like Catherine, and there's a lot of other unselfish people who are involved in this every single day that deal with these victims who are oftentimes neglected, ignored, pushed off to the side. And I think that, there's obviously still probably a ways to go, but we've done a much better job of dealing with victims. And I found how important that was to do that.
I knew a little bit about this, but listening to you and getting an inside look of what happened is so important so that we don't forget, that we don't become complacent. Of course, we have 9/11 to always remind us, but there are these cases like Pan Am Flight 103 that need to be remembered too. So I thank you so much for letting us know a little bit more about, how the FBI works with international law enforcement organizations in order to work a case like this.
Well, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about it because, as you said, we have 9/11 to think about in terms of recent history. But when you start to think about high school sophomores, they have no recollections of Pan Am 103. People 27 and a half years old, 28 years old, don't have any idea what that was all about. The world is a very dangerous place. And until we can wipe out this horrible scourge of terrorism and get people to work together and collaborate and take care of the other billion problems we have in our world, we're going to have these horrible events continue to happen, and it's sad, and it's going to involve a lot of people giving a lot up, including people dying, and it's very unfortunate.
Now, I know that you wrote a book. Tell me a little bit more about that. What's the name of the book, and where can listeners find it?
Well, the book is called ScotBom, Evidence and the Lockerbie Investigation. It's available at Amazon. I had no intention of writing a book, but I had talked to an awful lot of the victim families after the trial, and they asked me, "Are you going to write something?" Well, then I started to see a lot of media coming out of the United Kingdom, several books written by people that really had the facts wrong, and I felt like historically I needed to put the facts out there the way the court interpreted them. And I think that the way I wrote what I wrote will give someone at least the other side if you've gone to read some of the conspiracy theories, and unfortunately there are always going to be those in any major investigation. But I feel that I wrote that, and it actually worked out well for me because I was able to sort of put that part of my life behind me, because it was somewhat cathartic as well to sort of sit down and put my thoughts on a piece of paper. It took me about a year to write it, a year to get the FBI to approve it, and then another year to find a publisher to get it printed.
I'm going to make sure that on my website, on the episode show notes, that there is a direct link to your book so that people who are interested in learning more can find it.
Well, I appreciate that very much.
After you worked this case, you mentioned that you ended your career as special agent in charge of
Oklahoma City.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a little funny aside about that. I went from Lockerbie from working the Lockerbie case. I came back from the Washington field office. So I went out as the assistant agent in charge in Memphis. Came back as the section chief. And on December the 21st, 1998, 10-year anniversary, President Clinton and his wife were at the cemetery. I went to the memorial service, and I came back to the office late in the day. I got a phone call from Bob Bryant, who was the deputy director, and he said, "The director has just selected you to go to Oklahoma City as the special agent in charge." And he said, "One of the reasons that you were selected for that job was because the folks in Oklahoma City, it's only been 4 years since the bombing," he said, "there's a lot of people in that division and in that city that are still suffering. And you've already seen some of that with Lockerbie families." And he said, "That's one of the reasons that you've been selected to go there." So that was actually, it made me feel good that, because I was not sympathetic, maybe empathetic is probably the right word. I've seen some of that before. And it was amazing how little simple things, like in our office, somebody had a photograph of downtown Oklahoma City that had been up in the office for years, but it had a picture of the Murrah building in it. And there was a lady and nobody took it down. There was a lady in the office that came to me right after I got there, and she asked me if I'd take that picture down because it brought back bad memories for her. Mm-hmm. So, and whether she did ask anybody, I don't know whether she ever mentioned it before, but just those little simple things that you can, if that's all it takes to make you feel better, that's not a problem. I'll take it down. There's still one big difference, that the Attorney General very quickly said this was terrorism. And when Janet Reno said that put the FBI in charge. And so there was no mistake about who was... And, of course, there were a lot of other problems with that, because I heard a lot of horror stories about local agencies being cut out, and, some of the same stories that I saw in Lockerbie. As I told somebody one time, the FBI loves to be in charge. And I said, I discovered, all of a sudden I'm going to Scotland, I'm getting cut out. We're not used to being cut out.
So you know how it feels.
I know how it feels. And I said, I made sure that, especially when I was in SAC, we didn't cut anybody out of anything. You know, this is your town. You need to be involved in this. And we did some of those things. So you think about lessons learned, well, maybe not quite as well as we'd like to hope that they would be learned.
Let me give you the opportunity now to wrap up your career, your feelings about the FBI. What would you like to say?
I spent 31 and a half fantastic years in the FBI. I had opportunities to interview everybody from down and out to executives of major corporations to senior heads of state to represent the U.S. government at official functions. I couldn't have asked for a better career. I love the FBI. I've often told them I would do anything to help the FBI because I think they have a very important mission in our country, and I'm just glad that I was able to be a part of that for 31 and a half years of my life.
And that's the end of the interview. As always, back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find photos of Dick Marquise and the international task force members he worked with on this case. There are links to an FBI overview, a video about the investigation, and of course, a link to Dick's book, ScotBom, Evidence and the Lockerbie Investigation. If you enjoyed the episode, I hope you share it with your friends and family and associates. I make it easy for you. At the bottom of the episode show notes, I have listed all the social media share buttons. I want to let you know that I will not do a podcast episode next Saturday, December the 24th. I'll be back with you, though, on December 31st to wrap up my first year as producer and host of FBI Retired Case File Review. My crime fiction recommendation for this week is Career of Evil by Robert Galbraith. And as you know, Robert Galbraith is a pseudonym for J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter books. I am happy to report that I did like Career of Evil. The book continues with her main character, a private detective by the name of Cameron Strike, who lost his leg in Afghanistan, and his assistant, the lovely Robin Ellicott, his former secretary. They receive a severed woman's leg, and the book is all about their investigation to find out who sent it and is killing women in London. It's a great story. I love the characters. It's actually going to be an HBO series, and in my December newsletter, I'll give you more information about that. It is a bit longer than most crime fiction or thriller books. It's actually 500 pages, true confession. I skipped about 10 chapters in the middle. If you decide to pick up a copy of Career of Evil by Robert Galbraith, you might also want to check out my crime novel, Pay to Play, about a female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry, available as ebook and trade paperback at Amazon.com. If you were thinking about getting me a nice holiday gift, that's what I would like. As you know, the cost of producing FBI Retired Case File Review and my time is supported by those of you who have purchased Pay to Play. Thank you for your support, and happy holidays to you. Don't forget about the 2017 FBI G-Man collectible calendar that you can download from my website, use as is, or print out as many copies as you like. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.